examining The Good House by Tananarive Due from a Gothic perspective. So this story is primarily about a generational family curse and a whole lot of racism in America. It definitely qualifies under what most people would say is black horror. That is, horror that addresses a American black experience before anything else. And I would never want to take away from that experience, nor do I want to comment too closely on that specifically because I just don't feel qualified to do that. And I'm actually going to link several Black BookTube reviewers down below who have had longer book conversations about this, so you can get like a more detailed, broader perspective on this book. And if you can only view one of these videos, go ahead, find one of theirs in the description down below and choose their take first. That said, The Good House and Tananarive Due overall as an author feel like they're not getting their hype here on BookTube. And besides highlighting other people talking about her work in a more nuanced way, I wanted to put my own spin, review, and recommendation on her too. If you like the haunted house, gothic horror kind of vibe, you should not sleep on this. And that's why today I want to entice you guys a little bit to pick this up if you haven't before by discussing the 9 elements that on this channel could make something gothic. You only need 3 to qualify. Jumping right into horror elements. The Good House's horror is multi-layered and intense. We are dealing with a generational curse as well as land once sweet gone sour. In that aspect, there are like the traditional gothic sixth sense, getting the chills, having weird gross smells, things that only our main character or the family affected can perceive. And while this book incorporates a non-European voodoo sort of expression, the ghost elements itself align very well with those traditional Gothic expressions and elements. The incorporation of voodoo elements that Tananarive Due does here creates this sense of tension and uncertainty and unexpected in readers who are less familiar with voodoo. Even as someone who has done some study and research into those more traditional religions, I found myself unsure of where or how things were going to go, and that created a very unique kind of tension and horror for me in a Gothic work I hadn't experienced in a long time. There's like this sense of unpredictability, this sense of knowing there are rules but not knowing what those rules are, that I don't usually get to experience anymore in Gothic literature because the rules for ghosts, the rules for those traditional myths and stereotypes are so like ingrained, multi-layered, and expected in traditional Gothic work. We don't see authors expanding outside of that as often as I think we should, and this is just really refreshing, beautiful, engaging in that way. There's a level of stripping reality bare that you can see in a lot of these traditional religions that you just don't get in something that's a little bit more westernized and obscured. Like the sacrifice of animal. A lot of the spells and practices that we do get description of in The Good House require animal blood, sacrificing an animal, taking animal feathers, bones, meat, all of that kind of stuff. It implies that the practitioner would actually need to kill an animal to complete the ritual. That's something a lot of us in modern day just don't have any experience or frame of reference for, and in fact, even if we are meat eaters, we're horrified by the idea. This feeling about animals suffering and not even being used for self-sustenance in a way that really repulses people and makes them afraid. And there's even this debate that I could get sidetracked about whether or not animal sacrifice is necessary and whether or not this magic works or you're just torturing an animal becausies, but I won't do that. I just think in the modern perception, animal suffering and torture is highly effective and evocative in a way that human torture is not always. And I think the debate about when killing is justified on an animal stage is like a microcosm of asking about when it's okay to kill a human or when you're willing to give up a certain level of thing, potential to gain something else. It makes that very tangible and real, and it also creates a certain sense of fear. And then if you combine that with the fact that in some of these traditional voodoo setups that we see in The Good House, these altars do hold human remains. The people who find these altars don't know that much about the voodoo practice, so they don't know how they came by these remains, if the deceased person gave them permission to use the remains in such a way, if they were murdered to get these remains, like the list goes on of possible horrors. But even if we assume the person died of natural causes, if they did not give their consent to be used in this way, there's a certain level of repulsion and horror in that alone. It sort of reminds me of how Mormons will baptize graves post-mortem to force that person to to convert to Mormonism offensive and horrible, or it can be reminiscent of like the tomb raiding that we did for ancient Egyptian ruins. Like on one side, someone might justify that by all that learned, but the other thing is that we desecrated a bunch of graves to do that, and that's just disrespectful, full stop. I also think there's a certain level of horror and uncertainty in the invocation of the low or ancestors. These beings possess the physical body, but you're sort of aware of them but unable to control yourself anymore. There is this inherent trust relationship that you have to have, and then once you agree and they're in control of your body, you have to hope that they don't betray you. And because this whole faith is unknown to our main characters, leap of faith, uncertainty, potential terror in the loss of your own autonomy. I also think there's like a fun mixing of that traditional bump in the night haunted house horror moment with something that is unique and doing its own thing. After all, there is this scary root cellar basement that's a little too dark and shady, where like blood spatters appear and disappear and bad things happen to people who get locked down there and they sleepwalk there, and it's scary. Whoa. And there's like traditional symbolism of like grime in an otherwise pristine place, dirt, pile of leaves showing up in some places being well cared for and maintained, symbolizing the encroaching evil taking over what was once a sweet and sacred place. But outside of these more traditional Gothic horrors, there's also just a ton of mundane horror. There's a lot of different kinds of racism discussed in this story, and racism shown throughout time because it is generational. So we jump back to Grandma Marie's time, what people were doing back then, which was often like violence, direct physical harm, versus the racism of today, which perhaps is less physical but no less violent. Especially because even though both Dominique and later Angie don't directly have to face like Grandma Marie's trials, they do have to reconcile with the fact that like the old sheriff tried to take Grandma Marie out or tried to like scare her off of the land of the good house, and now Angie is friends with that sheriff's granddaughter, and there's been like no reconciliation, no understanding. It's not even a conversation they can really have between each other. So it's like this hurt that's just being left silent and building tension. It seems like only half the people in the room can really acknowledge or understand or appreciate. Both Tariq and Naomi express different levels of racial prejudice they experience in their fields. I think with Tariq and Corey especially, there's a lot of examination about what it means to be a black man in America, how they have to put on a certain kind of front. There's a bunch of different expectations for them in different situations, and how they have to walk that walk just right and fulfill those expectations in exactly the right way, or the consequences could very well still be physical and dire for them. And I think there's also this certain level of anger about how and when they break these stereotypes. Like in Tariq's case, he is especially bookish and learned, which is sort of like a break from the stereotypical jock stereotype, as well as like a break from like perception of like a black athlete in specific. The way he values that, the way he expresses it, how that seems to actually build into his rage instead of like dissipating it, is all very fascinating character study on page. And also sort of like terrifying that this thing that's outside of Tariq's control has shaped him and warped him in such a way that makes him a scary, dangerous person, when it's a pressure that was unfairly placed upon him and which he can do nothing to ever shrug off. And of course, like, racial prejudice is a large part of Corey's anger as well. Part of what he hates about going to Sacagawea isn't just that he's isolated from all of his friends and that his mom's pulled him out of everything he knows and is building, but that the people in Sacagawea stare at him like he is a zoo exhibit, and some of them are hostile to him just outright. Like, how is that fair to him to lose all of his friends for the summer and be forced into a town where there's nothing to do but just presented as the one black guy they sort of ever see? And it felt a little bit like there was critique on black culture as the whole, and like responses to trauma and more difficult racist circumstances, where like a parent might be trying to correct or protect from those realities or prepare someone for those realities, and it actually causes them to do more harm, to make them less trustworthy, to make their son or daughter less likely to come to them in times of need, and that actually makes that child more vulnerable and easily preyed upon than they would have otherwise been. We see that some in Angie and Grandma Marie's relationship, where we learn that Angie was molested as a young child by a teacher, and we also see that between Angie and Corey, ultimately leading to Corey's death. Like, the lack of trust and confidence that they had in confiding in adults around them, the fact that they were more afraid of being punished and they resented that kind of punishment or strictness that wouldn't let them do what their peers around them were doing, all of that combined into a more tragic and awful scenario for them than maybe they were potentially protected from other scenarios these people thought would happen if they didn't have strict hold on them. It creates like this horrific damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation, because I'm sure there's counter arguments to that. If they hadn't raised those kids in that way, they wouldn't have been prepared for these kind of things, and those kind of things would have gotten them instead. That makes me, as like sort of a white person, feel a little bit removed from the ability to judge certain actions or decisions because I don't fully understand all of those implications. But in writing like Tananarive Due's, I can see some of them, and I can understand why that character is doing what they're doing, even as I can see what's going on is further damaging that person more than it seems like they're being protected, at least in this moment. The tragedy and the horror of that is just something that hits you in the gut way more than I think a creepy house ever could. And there's also this ever-present threat of domestic violence. When we first meet Angie, she's trying to reconcile with her estranged husband Tariq, and she's so terrified of him, it's almost laughable that she thinks that they could salvage a relationship. When he sneaks up on her, she jumps. She's afraid that his offense at her jumping will snowball into anger and he will yell or possibly even attack her. Half the reason she wanted him to get rid of a gun in a past relationship argument they had was because she was afraid that he might use that gun against her or her child. Like, there's this ever-present threat that Angie feels she is only ever half a step away from getting beat to a pulp by Tariq, even when things are going quote-unquote well. And she seems to mentally have decided that if such a thing were to happen, it would somehow be her fault. Which, as a reader at this point, you might think is an exaggeration or show that Angie has something she has to work through. But later we get Tariq's point of view, and Tariq openly admits that he proud of himself for resisting hitting Angie on multiple occasions, for never like going too far with her. Which means he wanted to, and he for some reason thinks that he deserves a reward for not doing it, when that's like the core baseline, my guy. We see a little bit of that rage with Corey as well, where he like also seems to be on the edge of hitting, throttling, otherwise threatening or damaging his mother. We have to learn how much of this he's picked up on Tariq's manner and how much of this is like some kind of statement on inherent male rage within the narrative. I do think it's more generational than it is a statement of black masculinity or performing a certain kind of black masculinity, because we have someone like Miles who is also black. Although I guess there's a counter argument there that Miles is an orphan raised by white people in a predominantly white society, so perhaps he didn't have the same pressures and expectations put on him or the same kind of upbringing that Tariq and Corey have had. There is something interesting there that's worth exploring, but I am wholly unprepared to do that right now. And then lastly, I would just consider a lot of this book emotionally horrific. Tananarive Due does not hold back. There are just a million little tragic moments in this story, things that I didn't think would happen or that would never go on, people I got attached to who get killed in awful, gruesome ways. No one and nothing is safe in this story, and that level of uncertainty, tension, and danger really leaves you on edge the whole time you're reading. Moving us into number 2, character is king. All of the interpersonal relationships here feel extremely deep and authentic. As a story about a generational curse, I thought we got to know Grandma Marie, Angie, and Corey very well, and like we had a very close relationship and tie with them throughout this story. Even though I didn't always understand their feelings or choices, I was highly invested in what they were feeling and what choices they were making. And I cared about what was happening in this story because it was happening to them, which sort of made the ending of this story both compelling and a little frustrating. full spoilers here, so if you do not want to hear about this part, please skip to the timestamp in 3, 2, 1. So the whole book, we're sort of reading the worst version of events in like the worst world that's ever existed. Everything goes wrong. No matter what choice you made, it was the wrong choice with the worst outcome. And even then, through all these trials and losses, Angie somehow comes out the other side with a better sense of self, with a deeper connection to her ancestors, with an understanding of her roots and voodoo that she would never have had before and probably would never have gained in any other circumstance. And she defeats the generational curse that's been plaguing her and her family. No one besides Angie survives this. The whole town of Sacagawea gets wrecked in this battle. Pretty much nothing in town is left untouched or unspoiled. So the price here was incredibly heavy, and I don't necessarily know what Angie does after this victory or if there's really anything for her past this point. Like, she really has to start all over again. She gets this like vision scene that happens between her and her ancestors where they explain that the Low are particularly happy with her earned a miracle. And this miracle sends Angie back in time to a critical moment where she is talking with Corey and she could have interrupted the cycle Corey was going down that led to his death. And even though Angie has no memory of what just happened in the timeline previously, and Corey has no memory of what happened in that timeline previously, but there's something in the air that cajoles both of them to make better, smarter choices. So Angie goes to interrupt and talk to Corey at the right time, and Corey chooses to trust her, open up to her, and get her help at a key juncture where they still could come together and defeat the evil. Everyone who lost and mourned gets to survive because they're never put in any kind of mortal peril. All of the boons that Angie has won out of the tragedy and hardship in the past timeline, she is still going to receive in this current timeline, but in a way that's much more streamlined. She's not reconnected to her ancestors, and she doesn't have this knowledge of her past roots that she had earned in the last timeline, but it also seems like it's not really necessary for her. And there is sort of this implication that this spirituality and this practice is really for Corey to carry on and Corey's future, and Angie's sort of on a different path. And all of this leaves me kind of torn because on one hand, I am happy that Angie gets the good ending. And I'm happy that all these people I was really upset got killed and didn't deserve to get killed and got dragged into this for like no necessarily good reason all get to survive and live good, productive lives. And I'm happy Angie is still going to get to run her talent agency and probably choose Naomi as her first client. That relationship from the first timeline was really strong, and I don't think you have to go through some kind of suffering or torment to earn good things. So even though I phrased it like she earned the talent agency through surviving Corey's death, like that's not necessarily how I see it. But I don't 100% understand what inspired her to make the transition here. But I'm also kind of devastated by Angie's loss of knowledge here. Like, it's great that, I don't know, her ancestors or the Low are helping her make the right choices at the right time, and she's being like led by her intuition in this way that had been closed off before. And it's great that good things are going to continue to happen to her, but the loss of understanding why that's happening, how that's happening, or having the power to directly impact or affect that feels not so great. Like, I guess it matters less because she's no longer being targeted by the evil, but it does feel like this ending is sort of saying ignorance is bliss, and I'm one of those knowledge is power girls, so I feel sad for Angie on some level that she lost this court part. Leading us into number 3, more poetic prose. I'm just gonna have to say no to this one. The writing is expertly done, it's interweaving past and present in a way that's engaging, and a way that I personally feel is necessary specifically because we're talking about a generational curse. Usually weaving in and out of time like this I find quote-unquote cheap, but in this case I think where we're mainly following Angie's thread and we're interweaving Corey and Grandma Marie's events when relevant to her situation, it does feel good and it makes the world feel really lived in. It makes it feel like she's making these echoes and repetitions that are awesome. So I love all of that about the writing, but in and of itself I don't think there are these flowery melodic prose. I don't necessarily consider this writing experimental. It's excellent. I love it, but it's not hitting that poetic prose standard in the Gothic way. Number 4, elements of loneliness and longing. Angie is often surrounded by people and yet somehow still completely alone in her own island. Her mother's mental illness sort of like kept her from ever strongly bonding with Dominique. In a lot of ways, she became the mother figure taking care of her, worrying after her health and safety. And then eventually she comes to find out that Dominique had chosen to end her life, and she finds a semi-decayed corpse of what was her mother. Horrific on all fronts and lacking in that adult relationship children need for stability. And that rolls me into her relationship with Grandma Marie. And it does feel like Grandma Marie really loved Angie and shaped a lot of her life while she was alive. But at the same time, there's like this level of removal between Grandma Marie and Angie that's really interesting, because it seems like Grandma Marie makes a lot of connections with a lot of people. And like her relationship with Angie isn't necessarily special or elevated or prioritized. It's like everyone else's relationship with her. And I think children need someone in their life that makes them the priority. So like Grandma Marie sort of failing on this front set Angie up to be in a bad way. For Angie, this is like the one solid, secure relationship she has. So she's always looking for more senses and connections to Grandma Marie even past her death, which is why she's there in Sacagawea, Washington. It's why she's making these recipe cards. It's why everything has been pretty much maintained from how Grandma Marie left the house. And Angie is also surrounded by like Tariq and Corey, and she still sort of stands alone from them. She really wants to connect with her son and is failing on all fronts. And her and Tariq are like walking on eggshells, missed boats in the night all the time. The closest I think she comes to a living person relationship is between her and Miles. And in that case, Miles is the one who's setting up barriers because he's been hurt by her in the past, because he thinks that she's already gone through so much trauma, because he believes she might be broken or otherwise damaged, and he needs to look out for her sanity and mental health. All of these things drive separation and isolation and keep them apart in times when they most need to be a unified front and trust each other. The fact that this thing wanted to destroy Angie's whole line and would systematically destroy or kill anyone who got in between him and Angie is part of the horror, part of the isolation, and also sort of like part of the longing that Angie has to reconnect with the world, to be part of society in like a normal way. Number 5, delving into human mortality. Death is certainly part of this novel, combined with the ideas that our ancestors live a life beyond this mortal coil. One of Grandma Marie's ancestors lives in a walnut tree that's on the property of the good house. And it's sort of claimed that Grandma Marie is also living there after her death. Within the story, there are voodoo rituals that allow other family members to come to the person calling and impart wisdom, or even possibly take them over for a certain period of time for certain specific things. The dead can come back in dreams to provide guidance and insight. In this world, dead certainly does not mean separated and incapable of affecting the mortal coil. It's not quite the same as still being alive, so certainly when a person passes, there's a level of grief and mourning, there's a transition, things are different. But it definitely feels like the gravity of death is mitigated some by the fact that there is continual contact and communication between those alive and those who have passed. Combine that with the fact that the evil spirit can effectively take over multiple people's bodies and kill the soul that lives in there. By that I mean like Tariq is fighting this evil spirit for a number of years, but eventually his soul weakens so much that the spirit is able to completely conquer it, take over his body, and subsume his whole reality and life. Like when we're fighting Tariq later in the story, he is no longer present. Like he is essentially been killed, even though his body lives on and is a vessel for the evil. We see the same thing with another like local neighbor. He ends up murdering his child, and it's because the evil spirit has taken over from him. And even when he like breaks free and warns Angie, you can tell it's not really him as he was before the evil had touched him, as he's like secretly gleeful for horrific things and incapable of appropriately mourning even when he knows that the spirit has taken these things from him. He's not able to overcome that spirit's control or perception entirely. So that means that people who are quote-unquote alive are also dead and past communication in a way that the quote-unquote dead are not if you're able to communicate with your ancestors. So that's like like a significantly more complicated and interesting perception of what is alive and what is dead and how important that is in the grand scheme of things. So I don't personally think that death and mortality are like a huge thematic element in The Good House. This book is more experimenting with the Black experience and culturally what life and death might look like for them and how that might be different than like a more westernized Christian thought, especially as this view on death seems to have like less permanence and less repercussion than some things that we sort of take for granted when it comes to being alive, like our own agency or ability to communicate with others. Moving us into 6, the supernatural element. I love all of this fictional insight and like sort of thought experiment on what a voodoo practice would look like in modern day and past times, what that lineage looks like, how it carries over, what those more traditional gods would look like and act like, what it would mean to be able to converse with your ancestors in this way. And I feel like this is a real religion and there are elements that are real within the narrative and true to this faith, but we are talking about a generational curse with an angry spirit that's like murdering people and completely possessing them and taking them over. So there's somewhere in there is this line of supernatural we've crossed over to. I like that, like beyond the traditional voodoo elements, we also sort of like tie that into Native American spirituality. While we don't like directly name a specific Native American tribe, which is probably good, we do talk about the concept of land spirits and how like localized gods have different impacts in different places, and this land of the Good House specifically has a better connection to the spirit realm, whether it's like the voodoo gods, the Native American spirits, or ancestors in general, than other pieces of land. This is like a pretty common polytheistic belief. Your deities are stronger or weaker in different places. So I like that we're exploring it here in the Good House and making full utility of it and sort of like pointing out different commonalities between different tribal practices, even when there might not be much else besides that is the same. Also, the fact that the Native Americans talked to a lot of spirits on this land and actually sealed this bad spirit up a long time ago because it was too interested in violence and death, and then Grandma Marie releases it. It's again showing how different polytheistic faiths validate each other's experiences and recognize both are true, because there's not like that contradiction that you might see in a Judeo-Christian church where there's one and only one God. Instead, it's like a yes and, as well as like a hospitality, recognizing the laws of that local area and those local spirits, which you have to incorporate and consider when all deities are stronger or weaker depending on where you're at. And two, I always appreciate about voodoo that they blend these traditional symbols with Christianity, again showing how like this is a faith that incorporates what works, which is similar to a lot of other polytheistic faiths when Christianity came to like sort of dominate them. We do talk about that more traditionally in like the European side of things, where like there are a lot of similarities between Christmas and Yule, and it doesn't seem like when people came to convert some of these other tribal faiths a little bit later on in Christianity's life that we incorporated as many of those traditional tribal practices into Christianity to sort of like ease them into it. So you get to see the reverse happening, where like these traditional practitioners started taking on some of the Christian trappings and maintaining their own faith. I also really love how ancestor worship is handled in this story. Even before Angie delves into her supernatural experience, she's talking about how she has moments being in the Good House where she feels especially close to Grandma Marie, certain things she does that makes her think Grandma Marie is with her in that moment. The way she categorizes it and describes it perfectly walks the line of like a supernatural, really happening spirit ghost connection moment, like religious experience sort of thing, versus like a metaphor or a way someone's talking about keeping a memory alive, but not like saying they're actually experiencing another consciousness or person with them in the room. That kind of memory keeping and thoughtfulness and mindfulness really sets us up in the early era to roll into the idea that yes, Grandma Marie is really here, she is really looking out for her family line and trying to help them solve this curse situation and save their lives. And as a note, I do like how this religious, spiritual, supernatural element lets us compare how POCs seem to have like this connectedness to their families, their faith, and their land, while white people generally feel disconnected. For example, Grandma Marie's indigenous husband, quote unquote, Red John, sort of felt like bound to the land of the good house, the practices of his ancestors, and like when Grandma Marie and him get married, it's partially spiritually as medicine people, where they acknowledge each other's skill set and like are helping each other level up and honor the land they're living on. And more obviously, both Angie and Corey are suffering for a mistake that Grandma Marie made, where she called upon a bad spirit to get revenge for all these racist people who were attacking her. She had one moment where she let her rage overcome her, where she felt helpless and alone and wanted a little bit of her own back, and the only way she knew how to do that, she broke down, asked for the help, and both Grandma Marie, Dominique, Angie, and Corey are all suffering, being handed, and like slowly being destroyed for that one moment. And meanwhile, it feels like all the white characters in this book have no sense of lineage. Like, they're not really the focus of the story, but still, there are these very poignant moments where, like, one of Angie's best high school friends' grandfather was the racist sheriff who shot up Grandma Marie's front door. Angie isn't even allowed to talk about the racism that Grandma Marie faced because it would make white people uncomfortable, but specifically, she's not allowed to address the fact that her best friend's grandmother was a racist piece of shit who sort of, like, instigated Grandma Marie talking to the bad spirit, sort of like kicked this whole generational curse off. Feels so unfair, and it feels like this character gets to be friends with Angie, never has to do any work, never has to deal with the sins of her family's past, which are much larger and greater than what Grandma Marie did. There are just no negative repercussions for her. She can completely divorce herself from that and still love and care for her grandfather in an uncomplicated way, which we could read first and foremost as white privilege. And I don't think that would be a wrong way to look at it, that you get to be your own separate individual and not like a representative of your family and your race in any space you enter. But we can also look at this from like a supernatural cultural perspective, because this woman is clearly not beholden to any of her ancestors' past deeds or choices. But she also gains no wisdom, insight, or help from these people. And there is sort of like this idea that whiteness in America is like this monolith, monoculture, and I think to a certain degree that's something that we have tried to do. When like white people have their own cultures, like you'd be Irish or Scottish, French, English, certain kinds of Spanish, Italian, all of these groups now often qualify as white, but a lot of times these people have divorced themselves from their roots or don't even know what they are anymore and have chosen to lose those practices, those individual faiths or cultures, for this sort of like self-determination, I am my own being, I make all the decisions sort of thing that has pros and cons, in which case the pro is that you're not responsible for all the wrongs of your ancestors, and the cons being that you also don't gain any of that wisdom, insight, or like extra rich depth or culture that would come from those lineages. And if you roll this like back into the actual story, Angie's best friend has a family with her husband and a young son, right? And she confides in her husband. She told Angie some core information that's going to help her with the evil spirit obliquely. And the evil spirit takes over her husband and punishes this woman by killing off the son using the husband's body. The possession of this husband is immediate and almost instantaneous. He doesn't really have that strong connection to the good property. And like we come to understand some of the rules of this evil spirit, and it doesn't feel like he should have been able to do this possession so quickly without more contact from the good place or without like calling to this evil spirit in specific, but he does manage it. And then like if you compare that in contrast to Tariq, who left his sentimental first car on the good place's property, and it still was something that he was able to fight off possession-wise for years, it feels like Tariq's bookish connection, his connection to the Black community, to supporting Black culture, to being with those people and acknowledging and celebrating his own ancestors, gave him some kind of protection, even though he'd also unwittingly created more vulnerability by having this car directly on the property, by being married to Angie, so having a significantly closer degree of connection to the evil spirit, and by having all of this rage and anger that it was easy for the evil spirit to feed off of, to like get inside him and take control. He has all these factors working against him, significantly more than this rando white guy over here. And he still fought it off for so much longer. The way I read that is that like his own connection to his community, to his ancestors, to his traditional practices, even though like he is not a medicine healer in and of himself, sort of like saved and protected him for years and years and years, where like these white people who are disconnected from all of that don't have that kind of protection, so they're very easy to overwhelm. This is all sort of deep for the supernatural element category and generally how I talk about things in this sort of Gothic review format. But here's the thing that I love about a supernatural element is it gives you a chance to examine and pull apart and look at all these little elements and then sort of apply them in a more realistic, practical sense. The setup of this world, the horror, the supernatural lets you think and talk about these things that might be harder to think and talk about if we're just talking about it in a real world context. Which brings us into number 7. Questioning a character's mental health and mental reality. We're sort of first introduced to this when we learn about Angie's mother, Dominique, and how she keeps claiming that she's seeing demons, they're tempting her, she's fighting them, and she eventually succumbs to suicide. An event that Angie thinks is tragic and a sign that her mother was always mentally unbalanced and did not get the appropriate help. We sort of come to find out later this was supernatural, but it sets the tone for us questioning Angie's mental stability and fortitude, whether or not this is like an inherited thing or not. And it sort of also opens the door for us to question whether or not what we're seeing is supernatural or if this is a mental condition. Although I think the novel itself is quite clear about which of the two this is. We also find out that Angie checks herself into a mental institute after her son's death because she's not coping well. And the doctors clear her. How she's feeling and grieving is all fine and to me pretty normal. It doesn't suggest some kind of underlying instability. Miles, who thinks that like the weight of grief and the amount of it that Angie has been suffering has been pushing on her and pushing on her to breaking point. And the fact that she went to a mental institute at any point in time suggests that she's very fragile and near breaking point, perhaps has already broken once before. So like any further tragedy or distress is going to be that like one little straw that breaks the camel's back, which makes him doubt her perception, doubt what she's saying, thinking, or believing. And that doubt, that holding back from embracing the supernatural, embracing her plan, is ultimately what gets him killed and also what leads to a lot of tragedy and difficulty for both of them in the narrative. Leading us into number 8, making use of local folklore, superstition, and myth. I think this begins when we get just like the slightest little touch of an indigenous belief about the good house and the land that it's on, sort of establishing that this is a place where spirits and humans can interact, where, I don't know, the veils are thin or however you want to phrase that. It's been around for generations and generations and kind of like fact-checked and based off of lots of human experience. And this place was specifically one that Grandma Marie's ancestors and gods led her to, which is again sort of like reinforcing the local element, the folklore, the myth part. And even before Angie believes in the supernatural, she does believe in like this stronger connection between her and her grandmother or like her ancestors overall in this home specifically. Partially because it's been maintained how Grandma Marie would have wanted it, because she has those recipe cards, because it has this history. But she goes to the good house to be close to Grandma Marie. And she wants to borrow some of the magic or the memory that comes from the good house and like instill it into her relationship with Corey, and maybe just instill it into Corey in general to keep him protected and safe when he travels other places. And we do get like even the most mundane perspective on it, because the white people who just think that this is a rando house or whatever still all sort of congregate in this one spot in the back in the woods called the spot. And like everybody likes to hang out there. They feel like there's a special atmosphere or environment going on there. People go there for their like spicy alone time when they're teens. They also have bonfires and parties there. They like to paintball there. So even though they don't have like a specific specific urban myth or legend to go with the good house or this place. There is like this word of mouth sense that going there makes you feel better about your life, that you can be healed at this land specifically, and I think that qualifies you into local folklore and myth. And then number 9, strong sense of place. Even though we come to find out it's not the house itself that is its own character, it's rather like embodying the good spirits of like Grandma Marie and the powerful ancestors, or the evil spirit that's trying to destroy everything. At first, it's very much like the house has a will and a mind of its own, and whether it's doing good things for the occupants or awful things to the occupants, it's like opening and closing doors, it's flushing toilets, it's flooding things, it's making like dirt and grime manifest, or it's like brightening the room and bringing homey, welcoming sense in there. It's creating intuition and inspiration to help them find hidden compartments and secrets long revealed. That's all that sense of Gothic place needs to happen right there, is an extra character that's in the story and adding like ambiance. So as it stands, The Good House has 7 of the 9 Gothic elements, which more than qualifies it as a Gothic novel, at least for this channel. It's breathtaking horror that utilizes traditional Gothic elements and combines it with more traditional African-American cultural elements to create this really unique, gut-wrenching horror. You know, as someone who loves Gothic literature, partially because it's about discussing the other, it's about uplifting the underdog, it's about transgressing in places we don't usually talk about, I love having it written or explained or categorized in more diverse ways, and I definitely think The Good House by Tananarive Due sort of covers all of that. But talk to me in those comments down below. What did you think of The Good House? Or do you have another unique Gothic story for me to check out? And if you got this far, nothing else to add, give me the secret skull emoji in those comments down below. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep reading.